Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to today's GMF webinar on European perspectives regarding the upcoming US elections. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Alexandra de Hoop-Scheffer, acting president of the German Marshall Fund, and it's my pleasure to chair our discussion today. Obviously, the upcoming American elections represent a critical juncture for transatlantic relations. The outcome will profoundly influence the future of American engagement in and with Europe and NATO, and the future of American leadership and approach to ongoing international challenges, including the war in Ukraine, relations with China, security in the Middle East. And so it's critical for Europeans to prepare the different scenarios. Individually, Washington's European partners have different perspectives on how the outcome of this election will impact their own strategic interests. And GMF, with its extensive network of offices, experts across Europe, has been actively driving and facilitating these crucial conversations on both sides of the Atlantic, bringing together governments, strategic thinkers, corporates, civil society representatives. And so with that, our goal today is, one, to explore the diverse European perspectives on potential US election outcomes. Number two, discuss different approaches European countries may adopt in managing their future relationship with Washington. And number three, I also want us to take a forward-looking approach to our conversation. And I also look forward to the participants' feedback because many of you are working closely on these issues. And so I will be asking our speakers today, how do they view from their European capital the future of the transatlantic relationship in the next 4 years? I'm absolutely delighted to welcome my GMF colleagues based in different European locations and representing different GMF programs as speakers in this webinar today. Michal Baranowski, the Managing Director of GMF East. He is based in Warsaw, and so he will be presenting us the perspective from Poland. Suda David Wilp, the Managing Director of our Berlin office, and so she will be providing us with the perception of the American elections from Germany. Christina Kausch, our Deputy Managing Director for South, she is based in Madrid, and she will give us insights into the Spanish perspective on the American elections. Martin Cancet, the Managing Director of GMF's Risk and Strategy workstream, and he's also the Director of GMF's Paris office, and he will offer us a French perspective. And then last but not least, Gesine Weber, our fellow working on European affairs and European security affairs, and she will be explaining how European institutions prepare for these elections. So we are very lucky to have 5 speakers today. They will offer us to better understand how these various European perspectives are looking at the US elections, outcomes, and scenarios. Before we dive into the conversation, just a few housekeeping reminders. This event is being held on the record and is being broadcasted live. If you want to ask a question, it is possible. Please use the Q&A function in the chat, and please use it as we go through the conversation. And so what I will do is start with a round of 3 questions to all speakers and then open it to an interactive conversation. So let's get into it. The first question I would like to ask our speakers is how our European partners are assessing the US elections' impact on their national interests, but also on Michal, my colleagues based in Warsaw. Please, Michal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and it's wonderful to be with all of you, joining you from Warsaw. from the eastern flank of the alliance, both EU and NATO. And I very much agree with Alexandra that the stakes in this election for us Europeans, for us Poles, and others who are living in this region could hardly be higher. Many see this, I know, in the United States as well, as perhaps the most consequential US election in a generation. So it's, the reason, of course, is because we live on one hand in a increasingly precarious neighborhood, only 600, 700 kilometers from the active war, and at a time where not only Europe is catching fire, but we see wars in the Middle East, and we worry about tensions in the Pacific. So that's what's at stake also here, and the policies areas that will be most affecting, let's take Polish interest, but it's really relevant for other countries that are on this edge of the alliance. Really, I would put them as key issues being security, managing alliances that US is organizing, and the impact of US election on democracy. I know we'll expand to on each of the topics. I know that I don't want to overstep my time, but also another important issue from here is that when we look directly to Trump and versus Harris presidency, this region has had different, more positive experience with Trump's first presidency, where the engagement, especially military engagement in the region, has increased, and the disturbances were not as high. That said, this is not the same moment, and that's why the government here, as well as other governments in the region, are worried that the impact that Trump presidency versus Harris presidency in those three areas, how the US interacts with allies, whether it remains an active player in European security, whether US continues to provide military aid to Ukraine and hopefully raises it, and also how this election plays out in our own democracies. Those are the key factors that governments and the strategic community in Poland is looking at this election. Let me stop at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michal. I'll turn to Suda in Berlin.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. It's great to be with my colleagues to discuss this very important topic. And you're absolutely right. Unlike Michal, being based here in Berlin, I know that German policymakers are watching very closely because they had definitely a different experience when President Trump came into office. And 2020 definitely was a sigh of relief here in Berlin because the relationship sort of reverted back to somewhat normal course of action, albeit with some changes. And I think the most significant thing is that President Biden took a very big bet on Germany when he came into office. He sort of turned a blind eye toward Nord Stream 2 and gave the Germans a bit of space, and that bet has paid off. Today, Germany is in lockstep with the United States when it comes to support of Ukraine. The country is meeting its 2% NATO commitment. And also Germany, if you remember, was a really crucial ally in the whole mission to release Evan Gershkovich and the other political prisoners in Russia. So I think like his predecessor, President Joe Biden, like his predecessor, meaning President Obama, sees the importance of Germany in terms of playing a pivotal role in Europe and being an indispensable partner in the transatlantic relationship. Of course, there have been some friction when it comes to China and trade. Of course, many Germans were irritated by the IRA. But at the end of the day, the Biden presidency has been a diametric opposite of what it was like under the Trump administration. And I think Germany is thinking it will certainly be in the hot seat again if Trump were to come into office after November 5th. President Trump was not shy about publicly shaming Germany on topics like migration or Nord Stream 2, and of course on defense spending. And I'll stop at just sort of leaving a statistic in the room. According to the Institute of Economics here in Germany, this country could face losses of approximately 120 billion euros over the course of the next 4 years if draconian trade barriers are put into place. So there certainly is a lot at stake here in Berlin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suda. I'll turn to Paris with Martin.
Thank you, Alexandra, and good to be here with all of you. Well, from a French perspective, obviously, the elections in the US also will impact directly our interests and our strategic priorities. I think there are 4 points that we could make as priorities from Paris. One in the security realm, and very much in line with what my colleague Michal said, the question of the future of the US engagement in Ukraine, the future of the US engagement in NATO is very much at the top of the agenda of the French strategic community. I think that we've seen over the past 2 years France becoming more and more a champion of not only Ukraine becoming an EU member, but also becoming a NATO ally. And this is something that will be directly affected by the results of the election in Washington. In the trade and economic areas as well, there are some concerns of a potential trade war in case of a Trump election, because we've heard Trump advisors talk about a 10% tariff on all imports, something that could be imposed on day one of that administration. But there are also some concerns if the Harris administration were to continue the economic policy of the Biden administration, same as what Suda mentioned, the memory of the IRA and the different legislation were passed under Biden, their impact on European and French competitiveness was seen as truly problematic here in Paris. And so the continuity of Harris is not necessarily something that French leaders see as very reassuring. Third point, general idea that the election in the US will impact European unity. And I think it would be wrong to think that the French or some French leaders think that with Donald Trump, you can build European strategic autonomy, or you can sort of strengthen European cooperation if Donald Trump is in the White House. I think that generally speaking, when you talk to French leaders, they expect that a Trump victory would lead to more fragmentation in Europe and probably a form of bilateralization of the relationship, with each European country signing their own deal with Washington, D.C. This is something that Paris is concerned about. Last but not least, there are some implications for our own national political environment. There are, as you know, in the French case, questions as to the future of the current government. We do not have a strong majority in the parliament to support that government. A Trump victory or Harris victory could empower certain factions, certain political parties, and also have an impact in the future of this government.
Thank you, Martin. Let's turn to Christina in Madrid.
Yes, thank you, Alexandra, and to all my colleagues. I won't repeat myself because I think a lot of the points that have been made dovetail very nicely with the discussions here in Spain. I would say, so I will dwell a little bit more on the more specific Spanish points. I think the concerns with this election in Spain can be divided into defense and trade, most chiefly. And on the defense side, the Spanish concern echoes the concern that we've heard also from our colleagues that is all across Europe, which is not only about Ukraine, but the erosion of NATO deterrence in general, in particular under Trump, obviously. And Spain has a more specific situation that it has the lowest relative defense spending in all of NATO, among all NATO members, currently at 1.28. That puts it in an awkward position with a potential Trump government. And also, it would mean that should Trump start withdrawing troops from Europe, it would need to compensate more than others. On the other hand, Spain maintains the aeronaval base in US base in Rota, which has recently, just this year, been upgraded with 2 new destroyers, up to 6, and 600 new Marines. So that will remain both under Trump and under Harris. And so in that sense, the United States needs Spain for its defense in the Strait of Gibraltar, notwithstanding who wins the elections. On trade, obviously, again, the impact of a potential new US tariffs that has already been mentioned, especially under Trump, but also under Democrat administration, is something that really scares people here a lot. 2 years, last year, the year before last year, it was the first time in a decade that Spain had a great trade balance. So that there was the first time there was a US trade surplus with Spain of 4 billion euros. And Trump is known to ask first thing about his partner, what is his trade balance? So that is an important element in the bilateral relationship. And Spain would be affected probably relatively less than other European countries because it's not a traditional export country. It's less affected maybe than like Germany or other export-oriented countries. But on the other hand, the amazing Spanish growth that it has seen over the past few years, it outpaces the rest of the Eurozone, which is at 0.7, currently at 2.1. So it's an enormous growth. That has been mostly based on more exports. So there's the fear that this whatever tariff regime is going to come is going to undo all of those advances. So I think that, and that way that would destroy the Spanish industrial fabric, as Spanish companies might not be competitive. Yeah, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Christina. And let's turn to Brussels with Gesine to give us an EU perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much to you, Alexandra, for handing it over, and to all my colleagues to already making already points that are, of course, also very relevant from the EU perspective. But when we're looking at that question of how the US elections are actually influencing European interests, I mean, it's always complicated to say there is one European interest, but if we take the political guidelines set out by von der Leyen for her next mandate, there are, however, 2 really key priorities for this mandate. The first one being sustainable prosperity and competitiveness, and the second one being all things security and defense, and being a more capable actor in the international environment. And for both points, I think it is very clear that the US elections are absolutely critical. Simply because you could even go so far to say that maybe the future of Europe or the EU as a geopolitical actor hinges on these elections, and particularly how this actorness can be articulated. In the scenario of a Harris administration, Europeans would most likely have more time. In the scenario of a Trump administration, I think there are 2 ways how that could play out. One way was already mentioned by Martin, which is the risk of fragmentation. And that is something that is taken very, very seriously as well in Europe, because if Trump decided to prioritize bilateral relations, everything on these key issues, namely prosperity, competitiveness, defense, would become much more complicated in the EU. Or other scenario, we see something as we saw it post-2016, that all things European security and defense and basically geopolitical actorness made in Europe leap forwards because there is not really an alternative to rely on the US.
Thank you very much, Gesine. So we've been talking a lot of disruption and the potential scenarios of disruption in the transatlantic relationship. GMF is a player in that field, which is that it facilitates transatlantic dialogue on hard questions and issues that Gesine, Martin, and others mentioned, which is issues like competitiveness that are increasing intra-alliance competition. but we also seek to shape a positive agenda for the transatlantic relationship and the future of that relationship. And so my second question to the panel is, which cooperation issues will Europeans prioritize after the election, be it under Trump or Kamala Harris? And to what extent do these issues vary across the different European capitals where you sit? With that, I would like to maybe first begin with Suda and then move to Martin. Suda, please.
Sure. Thanks, Alexandra. I think, the two interests, regardless of President Harris or President Trump next year in the White House, boil down to this nexus of security and prosperity. Security in the sense that I think for the Germans, there is a realization that there should be more capability built up here in Europe and more cooperation with partners in Paris and Warsaw in building up a not independent, but a defense sector here that can also take care of immediate security needs in the neighborhood. But there is still a desire to keep the Americans present on the continent. I think Germany believes that it's important to have the U.S. presence on the continent, let alone the NATO, the nuclear umbrella. But one example of this is, for example, the announcement that President Biden and Chancellor Scholz made at the beginning of the summer about stationing missiles here in Germany in 2026, which is actually quite controversial, even for some members of Scholz's own party. And then, of course, the second interest is trade and prosperity. This country is built on exports. It's built on open markets. And although they, people here also realize that free trade, that era may be over, given the state of the German economy, it's quite anemic at the moment. Negative growth last year and also a poor outlook for the remainder of this year. I don't think Germany will ignore across the board tariffs, and there would probably be an effort to work in concert with Brussels to make sure that Europe is protected and that Europe doesn't suffer under a Trump administration. Germany, on the other hand, has also boosted trade relations with the United States when it comes to LNG. It is dependent on the U.S. moving forward on LNG exports, but it is really wants to make sure that further disruption when it comes to economic stability is not in the cards after the U.S. election. And I think there may be the opportunity for more European cohesion, and if Trump is elected after November 5th.
Thank you, Suda. Martin, please.
I think from France, there's one thing that really doesn't depend on the election, and the result is that France will want to continue to build a case that a strong Europe is good for the US. And that will be true whether Harris or Donald Trump is elected. The idea that a European Union or Europe beyond even the EU that can play a strong geopolitical role is something that will help US interests, will be made by the French government in Washington, D.C. next year. There's no doubt about it. The second point is that France will want to have a role in designing the future of the European security order. So whatever happens around the war in Ukraine, whatever happens in the adaptation of NATO to the new security environment, there's a very strong desire in Paris not to let Washington, D.C. decide alone, obviously, on these matters. And though engaging with the next US administration on those issues will be very much a priority. On the Middle East or the Near East, I think there are these political and historical links between France and Lebanon, and the president will want as well to try to play some sort of card in engaging with Washington on this. However, there is also an awareness that France has very limited leverage on these issues. I think something that could be more constructive is cooperation on Iran. I think that everyone in Paris has noticed that Iran has been sort of back at the top of the agenda in Washington, D.C. We heard Kamala Harris say, I think, yesterday in an interview saying that Iran was the greatest adversary of the U.S. today. Given the position, the French position in all affairs related to nuclear proliferation, given the history also of the French role in the JCPOA in the past, there will be an interest and an appetite to work with Washington, D.C. More constructively in the years to come. I'll stop here.
Very interesting. Thank you. Christina, and then Michal.
Yes, thank you. So Spain, of course, shares all these broader EU foreign policy priorities, but aside from the fears in the security and trade domains that I've already mentioned, the more distinctive priorities, the added value of the Spanish within the EU, I think in the next years, is really that Spain is putting a lot of emphasis on engaging transatlantic engagement and interest for staying engaged with the global South, engaging with the global South, so-called global South, with the NATO southern flank, with the EU southern neighborhood. You name the framework you want to choose. And I think it has a lot of value to add in that sense. It wants to position itself as a bridge to the so-called global South. It has a lot to offer for that, not only the geography, but also historic, cultural, and political ties, economic ties. It has a much more positive image than many other EU states. And not least right now due to its more recent positioning in the aftermath of the Gaza war. So that is a strategic asset that will become more relevant, I think, and that would give Spain some visibility. Interestingly, so especially in the sense that it will become more relevant to the degree that whatever is the next US administration will alienate the global South, or will make it, or will that it's felt that the West is abandoning the global South or only co-opting it for specific items such as the Ukraine war. So I think that is really an added value of Spain. And under this package, it places a great emphasis on the Sahel, which is of increased concern. It is trying to get the US stay engaged in the Sahel. And of course, on the Middle East, Spain has a very important role to play, as I said, because of its more balanced position. And interestingly, Spanish officials tell me that in their conversations with Republicans more recently in DC, they were surprised not to get a backlash on their positioning and the recognition of Palestine and the overall positioning on this conflict, but actually a recognition that leadership and a clear vision is preferable to muddling through. So I think there's a sense that the Spanish position can, and the Spanish credibility can become useful in the future. And the final point on this also package is migration. There is already, for the last couple of years with the Biden administration, has been a very fruitful cooperation between Spain and the United States government trilaterally with Canada on migration to foment circular migration from South America. And that was, as you know, the migration issue was led by Kamala Harris. So in case Harris wins, that would be have a lot of potential moving forward.
Fascinating. Thank you. Michal.
So I actually am struck by the points I wanted to make, being similar quite a bit to Martin, which there is a new alignment, I think, sort of around Germany between Poland and France, with a slight twist, but it's fascinating to see how close our two perspectives have gotten, because from Polish perspective, I could joke a little bit that there are three issues: security, and security, when it comes to the next administration. But there is a twist to each one of them. One is that, like France, Poland will want to continue to see a greater European capabilities in order to build European pillar of NATO, not necessarily European strategic autonomy, something that the Polish foreign minister now calls European strategic harmony. But basically, there is a clear recognition that we need to step up as Europeans. And of course, Poland is stepping up when it comes to its own defenses. I'm sure many of the viewers know that Poland has now reached 4.2%, going to 4.7%, and perhaps soon to over 5% of GDP for defense. So that's one piece when it comes to the European security. And here I think Poland and France can work on our German colleagues. Nothing personal, Suda, but perhaps on your government. The second piece, equally important, if not perhaps more so, is security in the context of the war in Ukraine. We are very concerned, actually, with both administrations. And I can be honest, with Trump administration, this has gone, of course, even in most recent interviews of both Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. There is a concern that the next administration will twist the Ukrainian arms and force an early settlement, unfair peace, unjust peace that will just allow Russia to then reconstitute its forces. That's well-known argument, but of course, when it comes to Harris administration, there are concerns that there will be too much of continuity. I think it was Suda that used the word muddling through, and we just can't afford to muddle through because Ukraine is bleeding out in the process of not providing sufficient military support for Ukraine to be able to reach a just peace and stable peace, perhaps combined with real security guarantees best afforded by NATO membership. So that's a very big one. This is certainly where Poland will want to work with the US, both bilaterally and in the European context. The underappreciated, and I will stop with this, is actually the trade aspect, where not too many people talk about here, but of course we are, both as Poland and the region, very deeply plugged in to US-European trade relations through our economic partnership with Germany. So that's something that is not super high, but which actually has far-reaching European-wide consequences, where Poland, that is playing a strong role within the EU, that's an issue that Poland will want to champion, perhaps a little bit differently than its general image of focusing only on security. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michal. And we're going back to Brussels with Gesine.
Yes, so unsurprisingly as well, for Brussels or from the EU perspective, there is very clearly also a willingness to focus on trade and security. But from an EU perspective, that looks a bit different, because the European Union has an exclusive competence on trade, meaning that basically almost all the important trade agreements and everything with the US have to run through Brussels. So there is certainly going to be a willingness to engage on trade with the United States. But it will, of course, look very different, because we could potentially expect a more protectionist trade policy under Trump, so that here the European Union would have to make kind of extra efforts to try to deconflict. This is not that I'm saying it's going to be easy with Harris, but it's going to be easier, especially because there is a better chance to really have kind of a strong institutionalization of the relationship, because there's a good chance that channels like, for example, the Trade and Technology Council, which the EU and the US have installed under the Biden presidency, is going to continue. So there is certainly this part that is going to become important. Another question for cooperation, or also priority area, is going to be climate. And here again, it looks very different, because when you have a US administration that is also willing to have a certain degree of global leadership on this issue, the question is more like, how could transatlantic co-leadership look like? Whereas if there was a Trump administration, Europeans would probably have to rethink how they can actually engage with the US, and might have to shift that cooperation rather to the state level. We saw, for example, already a few years ago the opening of an EU AI office in San Francisco that also shows that the EU is becoming a bit more creative in its mechanisms and priorities for cooperation. And the same is also true for Ukraine, because the thing is, of course, the EU will have to play a role on Ukraine, but how it can work with the US will significantly depend on the president in the White House. And from an EU perspective, there is, of course, on the one hand, the question of EU enlargement. That is going to be a very significant question. And then also a big financial question related to, for example, reconstruction and all these things.
Thank you, Gesine. Before opening up to questions, and there are many interesting questions in the chat, so thank you for that. I would like to look at the 4 years to come and take a forward-looking vision to the future of the transatlantic relationship. Ask you to be extremely brief and tell us how do you see Europeans, and that's linked to what Gesine just said, engaging with the United States in the 4 years to come? What are European priorities for the transatlantic relationship in the next 4 years? And let's do that very briefly, and then I'll open up to the Q&A. Let's start with you, Gesine, in Brussels, and then we'll move to the next capitals.
Well, I would say the priority for the transatlantic relationship from an EU perspective is, as ironic or as bitter as that sounds, is staying relevant as the EU as an actor, because there is a real risk from an EU perspective that a Trump administration might just go to a bilateralization of relationship, and that all these channels that have been created over the last years, like the Tech and Technology Council, or the EU-US security dialogue, will just be totally undermined, and that the EU will just not be seen as a relevant interlocutor. This being said, on a bit more positive outlook, I would say the direction in which the transatlantic relationship should evolve from the EU perspective is that it really goes to this idea of, I would say, a partnership of equals, even though there will, of course, be a gap in terms of economic and military firepower that is behind that is totally sure. But this idea that Europeans are really taken seriously in the relationship, and that they are not seen as a junior partner or someone who is following the US, that is really the priority from Brussels. And all that, of course, also evolves in this entire geopolitical big picture of Europeans having to find their way in US-China competition, and define the transatlantic relationship also in that context.
Thank you. Let's move to Paris with Martin.
I think from Paris, really, if in 4 years we've managed to avoid new transatlantic crisis, that would be considered a success. I think the priority is to prevent a number of topics from becoming much more controversial, contentious with the US, and China being one of those. But I think on Ukraine, there are a number of reasons to believe that we may strongly disagree among transatlantic partners on the future of Ukraine. If we manage to avoid those crises, that would already be great. In the very short term, there is something that we need to consider as well, is we need to keep European unity in the coming weeks and months after the US elections, when perhaps we will not know the results right away, and there will be some sort of pressure from the media, perhaps from certain political actors, to force Europeans to take some sort of a position in a situation where there will be a lot of political tension in the US. This will be an interesting test for Europe if we manage to keep united during that period of time.
Suda.
Sure. So I think big picture, Alexandra, Germany is really keen to make sure that the transatlantic relationship continues to be an anchor of stability rather than a disruption or a disruptor. And, when you look at it from a narrow lens, I think specifically, as I mentioned before, Germany would really like to have the US still present on the continent, but is also not under the illusion that the shift is now moving toward the Indo-Pacific. I think Germany would just hope that there's more time so that it can work alongside its partners in boosting European defense capabilities as symbolized by Zeitenwende, sort of the turning point that Chancellor Scholz announced in 2022 after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So I think there is reality here in Berlin that no matter who wins, Europe has to do more for its defense. But at the same time, the hope that the US will continue to be a partner to take care of the global challenges that are mutual for both sides of the Atlantic.
Thank you, Gesine. Christina.
Yeah, there's lots to say. Also, I'll stay brief. So transatlantic relations is not an end in itself. It's in the end, it's a vehicle for joint geopolitical activeness. And I think in the years to come, the primary challenge to that activeness, both in Europe and the United States, is internal cohesion. And we better make sure that we pay more attention to that and not so much of what Trump or whoever else is going to do to us.
Excellent. And finally, Michal in Warsaw.
Very quickly, I think the next 4 years will be a time of conflict, perhaps global conflict. So that's one test for the transatlantic relationship, whether we can both still stick together and remain relevant for each other. That will require for Europe to step up along the lines that especially Martin and I discussed. There will be the second piece, I think, would be critical, which, by the way, all three fit really well, GMF, three pillars. The second one is about the future of democracy and whether the future of democracy in the US remains the shining city on the hill, the guidepost in which other democracies, both in Europe and in Asia Pacific, can orient. And the third basket is really the new challenges that over the next 4 years will certainly emerge for us in technology like AI, perhaps other things we don't see yet around the corner, where the best solutions will be transatlantic solutions, or will be losing this race to others that want to outcompete the transatlantic community or the democratic community, because I think this is going to be the democratic, more global transatlantic community than just in the North Atlantic. Thanks.
Thank you. And that's a perfect segue to one of the first questions I wanted to ask, maybe more to Martin and Suda, which is exactly about domestic politics and democracy, not in the United States, but in France and Germany. We also have elections upcoming in France and Germany in 2025, 2027, respectively. And so the question is, how would a hypothetical national rally government in France or a strong AfD in the German parliament affect transatlantic relations under either a Harris or Trump administration? And that is also, as Michal just said, a very big part of our policy work is to also work on domestic politics, both in Europe and in the United States, and see how this is impacting also our capacity to cooperate on some of the biggest challenges of today and tomorrow. Maybe just have your very quick take on that, Martin and Suda. Martin.
Yeah, I think in the scenario where the national rally wins, either in 2027 or even before, if we have snap elections for the parliament, there are two things. One is, if Kamala Harris is president, obviously you will have a major political tension between France and the US. There's very little in common, really. Although the National Rally since 2022 has tried to move towards the mainstream right on a number of issues related to Europe or to Ukraine. If you look at the votes of the National Rally member of the European Parliament, they haven't changed that much. And you know, the sort of mainstream ideas that you hear in Paris is quite different from what you see them vote in Brussels. So you would not agree on Ukraine, you will not agree on European security and defense. On the idea that the National Rally could perhaps work well with the Trump administration, there's truth to the idea that you could have a very strong transatlantic cooperation under very different values and different ideas with Marine Le Pen. I think in practice, though, they would face the problem that they will both have a rather protectionist economic agenda and defend national interest, and therefore clash on the economic at the economic level, and would find very little to work on. It's not enough to simply say that we share the same view of the world. In policy terms, it would be hard to see how a Trump administration and a Marine Le Pen government concretely cooperates in Europe.
Thank you. Suda.
So very quickly, some of the themes that Martin mentioned are similar to the stances of the AfD, the far right party here in Germany. And let me also add the far left party, the Sarah-Wagenknecht party, the Bündnis-Sarah-Wagenknecht party, BSW, because together both parties could probably reach a high point of about 30% of the electorate in next year's federal election. Now, none of these parties should necessarily be an actor or a party to a coalition government on the federal level, but they can still, of course, inhibit important national interests for the mainstream parties, for what Germany sees in terms of supporting Ukraine, being a strong partner in NATO, and also being an integral voice in the EU. Both of these parties are skeptical on the EU, are not for supporting Ukraine, and also have latent anti-Americanism in the fold. So they would certainly be a voice that would make it difficult. They could also erect hurdles when it comes to funding certain initiatives, but I don't see them being in government next year. One other thing that they also hold in common is that they both are against migration, and a country like Germany needs skilled workers. It's facing a demographic decline, and in order to stay competitive, this country needs to have more skilled workers coming into the country. So this could also pose a problem for Germany and Europe as a whole when it comes to European competitiveness.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have several questions dealing with China, and China appearing as a dividing issue between Washington and Brussels and European capitals, because Europeans and Americans probably do not perceive China to the same degree of threat. And so just to regroup some of the question, one was, how can the US and the EU strengthen their economic ties in the context of the US-China competition? And could the US-China first policy also present an opportunity for Europe to redefine its strategy to engage with the United States on some of these critical issues that we've been discussing? Maybe Gesine on that one, and maybe Christina, if you want to take it. Gesine?
Sure, happy to kick us off here. Maybe I start with the question of the China First policy and whether it is an opportunity to redefine the approach to the US. I wouldn't say it's an opportunity, because that sounds very positive. I would rather say it will force Europeans to do that, because there is absolutely no way, or let's say I do not see any way for Europeans to engage with the US without talking about China. We already see that, for example, today also in the framework of NATO, and wherever you have a conversation on strategic issues with Americans, China is the topic of the room. So Europeans will not be able to circumvent that, or to just push that on the side. In case of a China First policy by a Trump administration, I think it will really force Europeans to make up their minds about their own approach to China, because a China First policy would, I think, imply risks like, for example, much clearer extraterritorial sanctions, much higher risk of pressure from the US on Europeans. And Europeans in this regard really have to be clear which trade-offs they will be willing to accept, because a lot of the European economies depend on China. But on security, Europeans depend on the US. So basically, the questions that Europeans need to ask themselves, not only, but especially under a China first policy, is what economic trade-offs are we willing to accept for security guarantees? And to what extent are Europeans willing to follow the US on its approaches, even though it comes at an economic cost, to make sure that security guarantees are maintained? So this is basically the challenge here. And I would say it is not only the risk of a Trump presidency and the China first policy. We already saw that under a Biden administration, the Asia Pacific and China is really the focus. It basically started under Obama's pivot to Asia. So this idea that a China first policy would be the only factor that launches that process of thought, I think is not sufficient. But it would, of course, I think, significantly accelerate these reflections. And here again, we also come to this issue of fragmentation, because I think for those states that really depend on the security guarantees in Europe, and particularly smaller European states, there might also be a risk for them to be more willing to follow a US-China first policy and instead abandon a European approach.
Thank you, Gesine. Christina, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just again, not to repeat, but adding a couple of points. It seems to me, well, we all know that there is a lot of variation within the EU as regards to the best approach to China. So I also think that this is something that is not that much tied to who wins the White House this time. But it seems to me that the European policy towards China is very characteristic of that broader tension that we can see within the EU with regard to key policy issues, where you have, on the one hand, this sort of larger understanding that something is geopolitically necessary in the broader picture, which in this case is a pivot to, let's say, moving the center of gravity of transatlantic relations away from Europe, and where the center of geopolitics is, which is in the Indo-Pacific. And on the other hand, dovetailing that with my more narrow, more immediate interests also linked with domestic politics. For example, you could see that very clearly in last week's vote about the EU-imposed tariffs on Chinese electric cars. I think, for example, if you take the case of Spain, Spain is not really, is much less dependent on trade with China than many other countries. It has a asymmetrical trade balance, but it's nothing compared to the others. But the Spanish government made a U-turn, first voted against in June or July when it was, voted against those tariffs. And then now that he made a U-turn just because China threatened to hit back on Spanish pork and cars. So, you know, I think that tension really comes out very clearly. And I think this is here to stay in the years to come, and it's going to get worse to the degree that the tensions between the United States and China rise.
Thank you. A question to you, Michal, on Ukraine. Is there a risk of a forced settlement of the conflict in Ukraine with the normalization of relationship with the Russian government, and how would Europeans react? And another connected question, would you expect a weakening or strengthening of European defense capabilities in case of Trump re-election?
On the second one, it's an excellent question in terms of how much it will shake Europeans more broadly. The reasons why we have such a high degree of spending in the countries of the Eastern flank is not President Trump, but President Putin, and that's what people are preparing for. The question I would have, and I continue to ask this to especially to colleagues from the government in Germany, whether Donald Trump's second presidency would create a second Zeitenwende, or whether it would create a sort of passivity. So I wish we had this very question, this conversation 4 years ago and used the last 4 years well to prepare for potential drawback of US engagement in Europe, but we haven't. So we'll be playing catch up. But hopefully the catch up will be played, even if it is more importantly Harris administration, that we don't again waste the 4 years in sort of false safe of reliance on the US too much. And this comes from a very transatlantic country. When it comes to Ukraine, look, Ukrainians are, and I visited Kiev very recently, listened to President Zelensky, to the defense ministers and others. This is a very determined country, a very determined society, but is also getting tired. I don't think that anyone can force them to surrender. They will continue to fight even if the Western weapons were turned off. That, of course, would be a terrible, terrible scenario for all of us in Europe. The challenge that we'll be facing is if there will be pressure put on Ukraine over the heads of Europeans. And Martin mentioned that France absolutely wants to sit at the table. So is the case in Berlin, and it is the case in Warsaw, and by the way, Brussels probably too. So to make sure that along with the Ukrainians, we create conditions for just peace. That's going to be a particular challenge if the next US administration wants to do a quick fix. And that is, of course, the danger of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Michal. Does anyone else wants to react to that question? Martin, please.
Yeah, just on the Ukraine scenario, I think there is another aspect to this scenario that you mentioned, Michal, is that although most European countries would agree that we would have to bear the strategic implications of a bad deal, we shouldn't underestimate that a number of European political leaders could see as a political opportunity a deal where they could blame Donald Trump for the future of Ukraine. Obviously, this would not be good for Ukraine. This would not be good for European security if Ukraine comes out as a loser of that deal. But you could imagine that rather cynically, that some European leaders would be happy to say that this disaster is the result of Donald Trump's policy, and we are not responsible for it. And I think that we should also think about the fact that sometimes we have these strategic considerations that really are important, but decisions are sometimes made by very short-term political views, and that might be one of them.
Thank you, Martin. Suda or anybody else, you want to react to that question?
Sure, I can certainly answer. So actually, Germany is waiting to see if President Biden will make a visit this week. There is some talk that he may not be able to come because of the hurricane that's about to hit Florida. But I think he wants to come to, obviously thank Chancellor Scholz for working closely with the United States on Ukraine. But it's also an opportunity to reinforce that the Germans should not get wobbly, should stay the course, no matter who gets elected in the White House. And so I think it's going to be, if the visit occurs, it'll be an opportunity to thank Chancellor Scholz, but also to say, please stay strong. I know you have political headwinds, you have your own domestic challenges. We just talked about the AfD and the BSW, but Germany needs to be a leader in Europe, no matter what happens after November 5th in the United States.
Great. Thank you so much. With that, I just wanted to flag a policy paper that my colleagues Gesine Weber and Martin Coincé will be releasing very soon, which is Thinking the Transatlantic Relationships Beyond 2024. So stay put, and we'll be delighted to share the piece with you, the whole participants of this seminar. This is the end of our seminar, but it's not the end of our conversation, obviously. The German Marshall Fund, as you know, will be actively leading and driving the Euro-American conversation on the US elections outcomes, and of course, how Europeans and Americans can cooperate on some of the most critical issues that we are facing as partners, both domestically and also internationally. And I think, as Michal was rightly saying, we need to strengthen that transatlantic core, obviously, but we also need, and this is really GMF's vision today and mission, we also need to probably reinvent the transatlantic relationship, think of it in a more creative, innovative way, because our societies, our political systems are changing as well, and because we are facing an increasingly complex and uncertain international order or disorder, if I can say. And so this is really what GMF is going to be working on in the years to come, and hopefully we'll be seeing and involving many of you into this GMF policy work. So very nice. Thank you for your active participation. Thank you to my colleagues across our European networks, and see you all very, very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.